Welcome to another episode of Untethering Shame. Today, we're diving into one of the most heartbreaking experiences a parent or caregiver can endure: the loss of a child. Grief is a complex and often isolating journey, but when it involves the death of a child, it brings with it a profound sense of guilt, shame, and the haunting question, could I have done something to prevent this? Can I ever be okay? And what happens when I wake up and I start to feel like I can be? We'll be exploring this today with our guest, Lisa Boehm, who's no stranger to the depths of such grief. Lisa's life changed forever when her 17-year-old daughter died suddenly in a car accident. As she navigated her own loss, Lisa quickly discovered that our society struggles with understanding death and grief. She made it her mission to change the way we approach these conversations. In her book, Journey to Healing, A Mother's Guide to Navigating Child Loss, Lisa shares her personal experience with grief and her journey toward finding meaning and hope again. Grief isn't something that just fades away. It's something you live with. And Lisa's here to talk about how to live with that grief, how to move forward, and whether a fulfilling life is possible after such a devastating tragedy. She's a certified grief educator, author, and speaker who focuses on gratitude and living intentionally as a way to honor her daughter's memory. Before we dive into our conversation, I want to acknowledge the staggering reality that many parents face. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, over 53,000 children and adolescents died in 2022 alone, leaving countless parents grappling with unimaginable loss. For these families, the journey ahead often feels lonely and misunderstood, which is why we need to have these conversations so those who grieve don't carry the weight of pain, longing, and shame in silence. So let's get into it. Lisa, I always feel weird when I say I'm excited for these conversations because they're such painful, hard conversations, but I think you know exactly what I mean when I say I am so excited to be here with you in this space and having this conversation.
You know, I was thinking exactly the same thing as you were introducing the topic today. And it is weird to say you're excited to talk about grief. But as you and I have talked about, I think this is such an important topic. So thank you so much for hosting a space where we can talk about it.
Absolutely. And I like to start every episode, but particularly I think this one's really interesting to me to think about. I always like to do what I call a feelings check. So just a word for each of us to just check in. How are we doing coming into the space? How are we doing with our life in general? And so I'm interested in hearing for you, what's one word to describe how you're feeling in your life as it stands today?
Aligned.
I love that word. The days that I really have learned, I guess maybe once I learned what that word really meant, and the days I have woken up or kind of leaned into, I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel it. It is such a powerful place to be. And I think for me, the biggest thing is recognizing that my inner self is matching my outer self, and where I'm at in my past, present, and future feels integrated. Because I think for many of us, we spend so much time judging our past, fearful of our future, running from something, chasing something. And so when we can sort of be in that balanced state of all the aspects of self, it's truly beautiful. Okay, so let's think about this topic. I know we were talking a little bit offline. There's so much, I think, to cover. And many people that come to, whether it's a podcast episode, a webinar, they're going to a training, a group therapy, whenever we're thinking about grief and child loss, I think so much of the conversation is around that sort of immediate response once this tragedy happens. And yet I'm here talking to you years after you've gone through this loss. And I know you're still working through all of these different pain points, but I can imagine you a day, a week, a year after you went through everything that you went through, might not have known that you were going to then run with this experience and this data and this commitment to helping other people get to where they are. And so I'm curious, how did you go from someone that experiences deep, deep loss to where you are now, where you are holding space? I mean, you self-describe as an open book and you talk about all of your experiences so openly and so honestly to empower so many other people in a place where people are like, I don't even know if I can get through the day, let alone talk about it with someone else.
I don't know if there was ever a specific time where a light bulb went off and I thought, I'm going to do this thing. But I would
Mm-hmm.
say that there were a few things at play. Number one, early, early in my grief journey, like the first week for sure, sometime, I would always imagine my daughter over my right shoulder. Don't know why it's my right shoulder, but I would always imagine her watching me
Mm-hmm.
and kind of imagining watching me through her eyes. What was she seeing? What was she thinking? Was she happy with what she saw? Was she questioning me? So I always wanted to make her proud. I still do to this day. It's been almost 9 years. The other thing was, as you mentioned in the introduction, society sucks. Sucks, sucks, sucks when it comes to grief. We don't know what
Yeah.
to do. We don't know what to say. We're led to believe that grief should look a certain way. We're led to believe that, there's 5 stages of grieving and then you reach acceptance and then
Mm-hmm.
it's all done. There's so many myths and misunderstandings that once I started living this real life of grief, I thought, oh my gosh, somebody's got to tell the world that we have it all wrong. And we need to talk about it more. We need to enable and empower people who aren't grieving to be able to talk openly, supportive, and compassionately with people who are grieving. We need to take away this idea that we go to the funeral, we give someone a hug, we say, I'm so sorry, and we've done our part.
Mm-hmm.
There's just so many little pieces that I'm still learning about. Like when you said that you are a recovering or somebody in recovery from an eating disorder, I would
Mm-hmm.
say that I am recovering grieving mother.
Mm-hmm.
This is not something that I'm going to magically be healed from one day. So it's a
Mm.
constant process. So it's all of these things that are always going on in my head or in society or that I observe. I've worked for 33 years in oncology. I work closely with death.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that I could apologize to all the patients and families that I interacted with for, you know, 26 of those years or whatever the math is,
Yeah.
because I had half an hour of a lecture in oncology about death, dying, and grief. Half an hour. I thought I knew
Jeez.
something. I thought I knew something. And the interesting thing is, having talked to doctors and nurses and other people who you would think to be well versed in grief, death,
Mm-hmm.
and dying, they had as little training as I do,
Wow.
which just really paints a perspective of where we are as a society.
Yeah. I mean, I think the sad reality in what you're telling me is that your your own lacking of support, acceptance, in knowledge, information, both probably internal and external, like the people around you knowing what to do and how to help you, the more you collected the gaps. Gosh, I'm not getting this. I don't know what to do here. This part's missing. I feel like I am fumbling through this. The more you go, I don't want anyone else to feel like how I felt, which is such a strong place to get that commitment to making this work happen. And I think it's a really sad reality that you had to go through it in that very lonely way. And now it sounds like that you're able to see, and I was contributing to that in a very lonely way for other people, not intentionally. We're not saying the world sucks, which means you individually, listeners, suck because you haven't said the right thing when someone's grieving. We're saying we as a culture, as a community, in many places throughout the world, are so afraid to talk about these difficult topics that we just kind of, they're like in the corner, in the back. You can semi see that it's there, but you like keep putting things in front of it, hoping that you're never going to have to deal with it. But you do. And when we don't get comfortable with it, it's really, really scary to then face it. And in your case, you didn't have any preparation or warning something was going to happen. It hit you. It was there. And then suddenly you had to figure out what to do with it. And I can imagine for you, the moment you were in that seat of the grieving person, because like you said, you've been interacting with people that are next to death and losing loved ones for a long time. But the moment it becomes you, I can imagine you felt a pressure to be okay, and yet a lacking of even knowing what that could look like, if it could look like something, what that was supposed to mean. And then there's like this weird timeline where people are like there and then they're not. So you're like, wait, do they think I'm okay? Is okay this, or is it something else? Like, it's just a very weird experience. And so you mentioned your daughter, you having this image of her and this connection to her that immediately showed up. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what you experienced in those early moments where you started to realize, oh gosh, this is lonely. I don't know what I'm doing, and I feel like I'm flailing and failing, and I feel like I'm missing, other people are missing the mark. Like, what was going on in the beginning stages so we can learn from that as a collective people?
Well, I'll actually answer that by telling you a story, and that is the night that Katie died. The police came to our door at 10 o'clock that night, called my parents. My parents came over right away. I eventually sent them home because it was getting late. All of a sudden, a truck shows up in our front driveway at 1 in the morning. It's my daughter's boyfriend and his mom and
Mm,
dad. I happen to work with his dad. He's a physician that I work with. They come into the house, and
mm,
both groups of people, I was the one doing the consoling. My
mhm.
mom was on the floor, broken, devastated. Not that I'm questioning her grief at all. I'm not.
No, right.
Boyfriend's mother, again, complete disaster. And I'm the one
Mm,
holding and consoling and holding people up. And I think that snapshot in my timeline is representative of pretty much most of the conversations I've had going on. I hold
mm.
back, especially in the beginning, I held back saying, when people say, "How are you?" I held back saying, "Well, I thought about killing myself last night."
Yeah,
Like this, I can't, there are no words to describe how I feel.
yeah.
I held that back because I was in some ridiculous way trying to protect how other people felt, right? Because then if you're honest with people, then it's
Mm.
like, then I always found that I was consoling them. And I
Yeah.
just didn't have the energy 99% of the time to do that. So then the grief mask comes on.
Mhm.
I'm okay, or, doing as well as expected. Or I'd come up with these coin phrases, right? That would just kind of brush the honest answer off because I didn't
Yeah.
want to deal with the fallout of having to deal with them if I was
Mhm.
honest.
And this feeling of like, I'm witnessing everybody else needing to be taken care of. And it almost in some way erodes the trust that if you fall apart, they can take care of you. So it also feels safer, not just for them and you not having to take care of them, but also
Mhm.
what would happen if I fell apart too? And so it feels like this instinctually protective thing for you so that you aren't feeling even more lonely than you feel. Cause at least this is in some way, I mean, it sounds so fucked up, but in this way, it's like it was a choice to put the mask on. If you took the
Mhm.
mask off and they're not there, then what? Then you're alone on the floor and you're still trying to console them while you're falling apart. And so I can imagine this tension between I don't feel safe and trust anyone, and no one's really given me the opportunity because I can see it in their eyes that if we start talking about it, I'm going back to caretaker and I can't do that.
Yeah, nailed it. That's
Mm,
exactly what it was like.
man. And, I can imagine, and obviously you work with people and you've dealt with grief on a professional level for so long. There is this experience that people talk about when you lose someone or when anything, a major traumatic loss happens. Obviously, grief happens not just with death, but a major traumatic loss where your brain almost kind of doesn't take it all in. There's a sort of denial of it in the beginning. And so that first night, there might have been a natural tendency to come into that headspace because your brain's still trying to make sense of something that no parent is ever primed to hear. Like, you don't spend your days going, I'm going to hear this. I'm going to get a call one night. This is going to happen. This is the reality. So when something happens that is so far out of the scope of norm, your brain's in a state of shock. Your emotional self is both dysregulated and also trying to pretend like it's got it all together because it doesn't know which way to go. So day one might make sense to kind of go, okay, I'm playing this role for the beginning. And then as you started to, I'm imagining it doesn't feel real. And then it starts to feel real. And you're integrating the fact with the experience of it all. And so did you feel like your grief came and you hit it day one? Or did you feel like your grief came more and more? You had just already started hiding it. So if it was weeks or months as it started to hit harder, the walls were already up. And so there wasn't even the option to take them down.
That's an interesting observation. I would say from the get go, like the minute that the police officer and the coroner are still sitting in my front room, I remember my
Mm,
son sitting on one side of me, who was 15 at the time, and my husband sitting on the other, and kind of that almost that black tunnel vision, where I just completely
yes.
zoned out what the officer was saying. And I remember looking at my son and I remember looking at my husband and thinking, I will do anything that I have to do to hold this little family together. So I kind of put on like my Superman cape,
Yeah.
and I was going to be everything to everybody, and nothing was going to break us, and I was going to do everything for them to
Mm-hmm.
support them and keep us together. And that was kind of my initial thinking. Um, and fast forward to like that 6 or 7 month mark,
Mm-hmm.
when I was literally sitting in my daughter's bedroom, in this irrational place in my brain where I was asking myself these questions like, so if I took sleeping pills and wine, like, do you take the sleeping pills first or the wine first? And it's like I would think and think and think and think this question. And
Yeah.
thankfully, there was some kind of little safety mechanism in my brain that
Yeah.
couldn't answer it. Like I just got stuck. And
Mm-hmm.
then I would think, okay, well, I don't know the answer to this. So then I would have to kind of sort of move on from that. But that was a place that I lived secretly, probably
Mm-hmm.
for a month, 6 weeks, you know,
Wow.
and I would get stuck in the same place all the time. Thank God. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that's how I went from, this superwoman, I'm going to save the world, save my family, whatever you want to call it, to I need to take the fast track out of here. And
Yeah.
nobody knew. And I
Yeah.
refused to tell anybody. My husband first learned of this, I want to say it was about 4 or 5 years after we lost Katie. And I was practicing a speech I was giving. And he
Mm.
walked past the room and he kind of took, a few steps backward and he said, "What did you just say?" And I said, "Oh, you weren't
Wow.
supposed to hear that." Um,
Mm.
he said, I had no idea. And I said, I know you didn't, because I held it from you.
Yeah.
But again, that was me not wanting to burden the people around me. Like, your brain goes to just, saying it out loud sounds so ridiculous. My husband and I support each
Yeah.
other. We've been each other's best friends through this. The one person that I can definitely rely on in my grief, and I couldn't tell him that fact.
Which I think it's interesting from a few standpoints. I think one, the fact that it was more comfortable to say it in a speech to people who didn't know you than to your husband who did know you. And I
Mm-hmm.
wonder how much of that was the commitment you made night one of, I am going to take care of them. And this idea of, I don't want to burden him, even though on a logic brain, it's not a burden. You're both going through this. it doesn't matter. You made this is my role and my position, and I can't deviate from the plan. And I can't ask him to take this on too. So I have to figure out how to be fine. But there was this calling out. And like you said, you used the word safety mechanism. There was something in your brain that kept stopping you from completing these thoughts. But the reality that your brain was saying and your body,
Mm-hmm.
if this is where we stop, I don't want to be here. And I think there is so much shame in the silence in that, so much fear, so much
Mm-hmm.
pain. And I think it goes back to what you said in the beginning. Like, we don't talk about that. How often does someone go? I mean, I still remember I used to do youth mental health first aid trainings, and I would teach teachers and other people in the schools how to ask kids, are you thinking about killing yourself? Because we know suicide is a big thing in high schools and middle schools. And the number of people that
Mm-hmm.
couldn't say it because of their own discomfort. If we could just say,
Wow.
like, if we normalized it, you're going to think about killing yourself. It doesn't mean you're going to want to, but suicidal
Mm-hmm.
thoughts are normal after a major loss. Suicidal thoughts are normal after X, Y, and Z. Had somebody said that to you, it still would have been horrific because there's nothing to stop you from feeling this pain when you get to that point. And had somebody said to you, when this happens, this is normal. Here's
Mm-hmm.
support, or let's get you some help now so that when those things happen, you already have a safe and trusted person who's not your partner. Because of
Yeah.
course you're going to feel like you're dumping on them when he's had a loss too. Then you can
Mm-hmm.
talk about it safely and we can make a plan on how to support you. Again, when that happens to normalize that process, but you didn't have that.
Yeah. No. And that is something that I definitely try to share with people.
Mhm.
It's really important for people to know that is it is normal.
Yeah. And you said you had this experience and then it kind of moved through you, which there are parts I know when people talk about grief, they talk about sort of the natural movement of the body through emotions. If we give ourselves space and time to feel our emotions, that's often one of the biggest things we struggle with as people in general, as we tend to stuff emotions, we tend to do these things. In your case, I think you did what a lot of people do, which is basically create two persons. There's the Lisa that everybody else interacts with, and then there's the Lisa that I'm putting in the closet and I'm not letting anybody else see it. But you were still moving through some of it. So you kind of came out of that point.
Mhm.
But I'm also wondering because 6 months is not a long time for you to be living without Katie. 6 months is a really long time in the sense of other people forgetting to continue to check in on you. And so I'm also wondering,
Oh,
were you still having people around at that point? Were people asking? Had they just assumed things were fine because you said they were fine? What did that look like?
I would say it's a mixed bag, and I would suspect that anybody who's listening that has experienced deep grief will probably be nodding their head. I've come to learn that even the people that are closest to us, like I grew up in a loving family. I was always able to go to my mom and dad about anything and everything. I had a few trusted friends, same thing. But after we lost Katie, my relationship with my parents completely changed. Um, but I also learned that, like, I was angry at first. I thought, come on, like, you guys should be the people that I can lean on right now. And it
Mm-hmm.
took me a couple of years and meeting another grieving mom who was like 10 years further into her journey than I was. And I'll never forget she and I having coffee in a coffee shop and having this conversation. And she said, it took me a long time to realize that not everyone is equipped to help us on our journey.
Mm.
And she said, you think about your close family members. Well, your parents not only have lost a granddaughter that they spent an
Yeah.
enormous amount of time with, were very close with, but they're also mourning for you. And
Yeah.
it killed my dad in particular, Mr. Fix It. Like literally, he couldn't fix this and it
Mm.
killed him. So you've
Yeah.
got that group of people who, even though they want to be there for you, they can't.
Yep.
Or, even in the situation of some of my closest friends who were going through terrible divorces or other life situations, they weren't in a space to help me.
Yeah.
And then there's this anomaly that almost everyone I talk to shares. And that's this anomaly of people that we either didn't know very well, like acquaintances, or just even people that, friends of friends kind of thing that bubble to the
Hmm.
surface, that are just these beautiful souls that know what to do, know what to say. They show up, they bring things, they can talk easily and freely about grief and loss.
Mm.
But I think my natural instinct was right away gravitating to the people who could and would talk about grief with me. And
Yeah.
I was fortunate in the sense, I mean, it sounds awful to say this, but I feel lucky that I worked with a woman. We didn't really know each other, but she worked on the second floor, I worked in the basement, and she had lost a child in a car accident as well, like 4 or 5 years previously. And she reached out right away. And she said, I don't know if you're
Mm.
ready for this, but I just wanted to let you know there is a group of us here in this city. We do get together from time to time. We are here.
Oh.
And hands down, without a doubt, game changer. I mean,
Mm.
I remember clear as day when she sent me that. Like, keep in mind, Katie died on December 8th. She messaged me a few days after that. I went to my first grieving mothers get together days before Christmas. When I think back on that, I
Mm.
think, how the hell did I get there?
Yeah.
But I did.
Oh.
Like, it was this inner knowing somehow. And I guess because I knew her,
Hmm.
um, but being in the same space, physical space, as other moms who are going through the same thing as you, some of them further out than you, so on, their kids all died at different ages and for various reasons. You didn't have to say a word in that group. Or you
Yeah.
could say something so obtuse that anybody
Hmm.
else in the regular community would, think that you need to be committed.
Yes.
But they would just look at you and nod. Yeah, I
Hmm.
get that. I get that. Best advice I ever got, for the most part, was from other grieving mothers. The compassion
Mm.
from other grieving mothers. Um, So if anybody's listening that has gone through a loss, I would say seek out someone who is going through the same thing as you. There is
Yeah.
so much there that, that and a good therapist, honestly, your two
Hmm.
best tools.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking a lot about what you're saying, even about this group, which is you could go into a space where you no longer had to take care of them instead of them taking care of you. Like there was a community side of you're holding space for each other, but you didn't have to walk in afraid of, gosh, their inability to process and feel their grief is gonna, like, I have to take care of and tend to them. Like you all were there knowing, hey, we're here to take the mask off. We've already walked in the room, we put the label on, we've lost our children. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that moment that you sort of claim that space for many people in their grief, I think that's a scary step to take because it's like, well, now it's real. I went to this
Yeah.
group and I identified this way. Now Katie's gone. And so there's this element of fear and I think recognizing not everybody could have gone a few weeks after. And for you, the fact that you could go did give you some sense of community. And I mean, I've had that in all sorts of different groups that I've been in or been a part of or ran from a therapy side is like somebody that is able to talk to someone else about how they've both felt suicidal or they've both struggled with this addiction. There's this sense of acceptance that exists in this space of all the feelings, all the things you could say that I think you're right. It feels crazy to say them to anybody else out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things you said that's so key is oftentimes, when we are going through something, in your case, your parents are hypothetically the ones that can take care of you, but having to go, oh my goodness, they are not equipped to do that. They can't be in the role of therapist, support person, coach, you know, grief support specialist, whatever it would be. They can only be in the role of grandparent and parent and mourning, with me, they can't hold me right now. And that, I think, for you and your husband, also for you guys to have where he wasn't your sole person. Obviously, there was a defense for you in not necessarily wanting him to know everything, but also a protection in many times people have that happen where then it's sort of a feedback snowball back and forth of grief where both of you shouldn't try to hold each other. You're both allowed to fall and to fall apart and to fall hard and to have others hold that. One of the things I think about in this, because we're talking a bit about maybe the first 6 to 9 months of your experience of the loss, and now you're here 9 years later. There's a whole bunch that happens in between those 2 points. And like you said, this is a very iterative process. I remember years ago when David Kessler released the book Finding Meaning, and he had written the whatever 5 stages, 7 stages, five, right? It's supposed to be five. I don't know. 5 stages of grief. And so when he did that with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and they had this book, his next book that he wrote about finding meaning, I hadn't even read it yet, but just being a part of different therapeutic groups, seeing the reaction, people who hadn't even read the book themselves, but you can't have meaning. You're taking away from your son's memory because he had lost his son. And that's a lot of what prompted the book. So many elements of you're alone and feeling like you're isolated in your grief and you're in pain and you're supposed to be fine. There's a timeline where everybody just expects things are fine. They stop maybe checking in. They assume things are okay. But also there's a ceiling that gets put on you that you can never be too fine. You're supposed to exist in this not too much pain so that nobody else has to really worry about you, but not too happy because otherwise that's dismissive of this loss. And I think people that haven't gone through a major loss are like, no, that's stupid. No one would say that. No one would ever tell somebody they don't get to be happy again. And I've heard it all the time in the therapy room. And this shame and guilt of, am I allowed to move on? Am I allowed to? And it doesn't mean moving past, forgetting Katie or for anybody else, forgetting any loved one. It means, can I integrate this loss into my life and create a meaningful life forward where I can experience joy in the depths that I couldn't during those years my grief was very intense? Can I allow for myself to have the full range of human experience still? So I'm curious if that happened to you at all, or if there's anything that you kind of noticed in that, again, that threshold of maybe being put on you of be fine enough, but not too fine, because this is where we're all most comfortable for you to be.
Oddly enough, as much as I will credit, this group of grieving women with so much of my healing, I know people don't like that word, but effectively that's what it is. I will give them a massive amount of credit. However, I felt that I had to downplay my truth about finding happiness in moments. I felt like I could not express my reality. So we talked about the 6-month mark, which was truly devastating. At
Mm-hmm.
about the 9-month mark, my husband and son and I traveled out to British Columbia, Canada, and I had this incredible experience that literally changed my grief trajectory. And I'll come back to your question in a second, but I think the
Mm-hmm.
story is really important. We had just been on a hike. We'd been hiking through the forest. It spit us out onto this gorgeous beach. Gorgeous. But it was empty. There was nobody there. Beautiful day, kind of at the end of July, warm, sunny day, clear sky, the ocean's lapping at my feet on one side, the forest is, luscious and green on the other. And I remember walking along the shoreline and tipping my head up to the sun, soaking it all in, and for a brief millisecond, feeling intense joy.
Mm.
And then no longer had that thought come into my head that it was like a gut punch. And it was like, what is wrong with you, Lisa? How
Mm-hmm.
dare you? Your child is dead, for goodness sakes. And having that shame and that guilt. But then kind of in the next beat, asking myself, well, Did the grief go away because you felt happy? Nope. Did you forget Katie even for half a millisecond because you felt this happiness? Definitely not. So it was a
Yeah.
big aha moment for me that I could carry both the heaviness of grief and these moments of joy at the same time. But even though I felt that and I felt it was real and true and aligned to who I am, I couldn't say those words out loud. I could
Mm.
maybe say them to a few trusted non grieving mom friends, but I could never say that to another grieving mom for fear that I would be judged. And in fact, I did have one grieving mother tell me, "You clearly did not love Katie as much as I love my son." Because I could never
Oh my gosh.
feel even half a millisecond of joy ever. So trust me when I tell you, I sucked
Oh.
those honest feelings of experiencing joy right back in. And I was not able to say them or to be overt in my feelings. Like now, you'll see me at a neighborhood barbecue, not every time, but a lot of time you'll see me there laughing with one of the neighbors. Or you'll
Mhm.
see me at, I don't know, an event of some kind in the city having fun. That is what my mission is to live my life for Katie, because of Katie. And honestly, I've gotten to the point now where I don't give a rat's you know what if I am judged for how I am living my life. If anybody thinks, oh, she must be over Katie, or clearly she's done grief, I do not care. And I think as a human, maybe because I'm in my 50s and I've come into this area of not giving a rat's, you know what, but I think oftentimes we are so caught up in worrying about what people think of us. And
Yeah.
99% of the time, people are not even thinking about us. So
Yeah.
why not just be you?
Yeah.
I heard a psychic say once, and I hold on to this as well. At the end of the reading, she said, whatever you do, make sure you give Katie something amazing to watch.
Mm.
And even when I say that, I get tears in my eyes
Mhm.
because, like, look out, kid, because I'm going to be giving you lots of fun and things that are going to make you smile.
Yeah. I mean, my heart breaks for you and for that person that said that to you because you can tell, it'd be easy to paint them as a villain. What that tells me is someone that is so stuck in their grief. And I don't even want to say
Mhm.
stuck. The stage they were at in their grief, their own anger, their own loss and longing, they couldn't imagine a moment where they could experience that joy again. And so you experiencing it, they had to resent you. They had to reject you because that they couldn't have that. They don't believe that's true. And I think there are those moments where you're like, I have to be here. This is how I
Mhm.
honor them. And it's so hard to be able to tell somebody that making a choice to stop your life at a tragedy is not loving that person. That is choosing to stop your life. And to
Mhm.
stay stuck in that is not doing anything for them or for you. And there are people that are going to hear that, whether you're saying it or especially me, because I haven't lost a child, and they're going to say, you're coming from a place of privilege and big, giant middle fingers. And I'm with you. I think that's okay if that's their reaction. That tells me more about my longing for them to find space to grieve and to heal and to get to where they need to go. And I always feel this, it's almost like this, how dare you try to take somebody else's recovery away from them? It's
Mhm.
an interesting thing. I had this with a person on the podcast a few weeks ago where we talked about her living with a chronic illness, and she bonded so much with these other people that were in the hospital with her and in these groups with her. And as she got to a point where she was getting better in her
Mhm.
healing and her recovery, having to end a relationship with a boyfriend because he fell in love with her as the sick version of her, or friendships that had to end because they needed her to stay sick to allow for that friendship to thrive. And she had to let those people go. And so I think the thing that you're seeing, and it sounds like maybe trying to find a way to give permission to people for, is you're going to feel scared as hell when you wake up one day and you do feel joy, because you're like, what do I do with this? What does this mean? And all those questions that you felt too of, does this mean I don't love Katie? I mean, when that person said that to you, even this thought of like, probably both, like, screw you, but also, is that true? Does that mean that? Should I have stayed there longer? And there's this doubt and there's this shame. And like you said, then a silence. So then you weren't still living in a place of joy. You were living in a place that you were hiding again. You were just hiding a different version of yourself, because the world had portrayed an image of who Lisa is supposed to be if Lisa is a grieving mom. And this is the part you play, and you're not allowed to veer off of that. And so, I think so much of that is, whether we're talking about, this other person that talked about healing from chronic illness, if we think about intergenerational trauma, child loss, we have this tendency to want people to exist in patterns that are convenient for the story that we're living in. You staying in
Yes.
that place of grief and pain was convenient for wherever they were at in their story, but it wasn't yours. And so we have to figure out a way to detach from that, to allow that if I'm breaking out of these patterns, that doesn't mean I'm a villain. It just means I don't want to exist this way. But if I break out of intergenerational patterns of aggressiveness, passive aggressiveness, trauma, codependence, I'm going to be marked as the villain because I'm breaking out of the norm that they're still existing in. And so I think it isn't that you don't care what people think. It's that you've stopped making their story more important than the story you're living, because you're not living for them. They are allowed to have that. And it's still going to affect you on some days. If somebody came up and made that comment, there's still a moment it's going to hurt. It's just not going to hurt enough where you go, I'm going to start letting you write my story and stop writing it for me and for the memories and the relationship that I still carry with me and with Katie every day.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. And, what ended up having to happen, I think as human beings, we're always growing, whether we realize it or not. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. I think real
Mm-hmm.
growth happens after tragedy, after really
Mm-hmm.
hard things. But having said that, as human beings, I think our mission here on earth is to grow.
Yeah.
So we're always growing, we're always changing. And what had to happen for me was I felt this truth deep in my soul that grief didn't have to be constant sadness, constant, you
Mm-hmm.
know, darkness and heaviness and anger and all of this stuff, but that it
Yes.
could be lighter. So I actually needed to break up with that group of
Mm.
women. They are an incredible group of women. I probably wouldn't be where I am today without them. But
Yes.
to continue my own growth and my own healing, I
Mm-hmm.
needed to break a part of that. And in fact, I started my own group, not in competition with them. They do all their stuff face to
Mm-hmm.
face. All of my work is online. But
Mm-hmm.
my message is that we can carry grief and joy at the same time. And I give permission all the time. You know, if you are giggling your butt off watching a TV show, or you're down the street having a beverage with somebody and laughing and enjoying life in that moment, embrace it.
Mm-hmm.
But I needed to separate myself from these people who, at that point when I was ready for it, just had completely different mindsets and perspectives than I did. And it was hard for
Yeah.
me because they had been a
Yeah.
crutch to me for so long, but I knew that I needed to live my truth and write my own story,
Yeah.
as you just said.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about this, and as we come to a close, I'm knowing, whether a listener is going through their own loss, they know someone who's gone through a loss, they're anticipating. I mean, all of us will experience loss in our life in one way or another. I think this conversation, it's like a virtual hug for so many people that have felt that loneliness, but there's also this, I always talk about it like your brain pond. And when we get so used to, well, this is how I move forward in my day, I'm fine, I just got to keep going forward. The goal is when you listen to one of these episodes that we just like ran through the middle of your brain pond and it's not clear and it's murky and it's mucky. And you're like, what do I do with all this, all these competing thoughts and feelings and angst? And so I think about, for those people, if you could give them one takeaway message, one thing, and I'm guessing it's going to be something you already said because I'm knowing what I'm taking away from me and I know what your truth is and what you speak to people. But if you could just help recenter their brain on, come back to this, you can take with you what you want over time. But for today, maybe just hold this. What would it be?
Oh boy. Well, I would say if it's loss, since that's what we're talking about today, loss of a loved one, I invite you to ask what you want them to see. Conversely, if you were the one that passed away, what would you want for your children, for your spouse, for your family?
Hmm.
And I think it always comes back to the answer. Anybody that I ask that question to, it's always to see them happy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's try our best to live a life for them that makes them happy.
Mm. Lisa, I just want to celebrate you. I think there is so much courage in not only talking about your story and your loss, but being willing to stake out that place and to talk about something that makes people uncomfortable, which isn't simply the loss, but the finding joy, the ability to experience everything. And you articulated it. You had self-judgment, you had fear, you had shame, you had things that came up for you. You saw it in other people and you continued to take it one day at a time and move through it. And there's going to be a Lisa in the future that's like, I feel like I took 18 steps back. And that Lisa is still deserving of being here and still finding a moment of joy in that too. And I think it's really hard to force, I guess maybe force isn't the right word, to invite people to consider that what we were taught or the biases that we have about grief and loss and how we have to move through it might not be a complete picture. And I think that's so admirable. And I'm so grateful that you shared this space with all of us today.
My pleasure and my honor. Thank you for giving both of us the space to talk about this difficult subject.
I know there are going to be people that are going, I feel seen and I want to have more conversations. I feel like Lisa is the person I want to do some of my own grief work with, whether this is a loss they've recently experienced, maybe a past loss that they're moving through. What is the best way for someone to reach out and connect with you?
Pretty much everything is connected through my website, which is griefsupportformoms.com. And all my socials are there, my blog, contact form. But even though, I specifically speak to grieving mothers,
Mm-hmm.
I am always open to have a conversation about grief, and even
Mm-hmm.
beyond loss of person. It is a subject that is really near and dear to my heart for so many reasons.
Yeah. And I hope listeners, you're taking that and knowing you could see the website and go, okay, well, I'm not a mom or I didn't lose a child, so I can't reach out to Lisa. Gosh, I have to find someone else. What she's saying is that grief has a right to feel heard and to take up space. And if she can help create a safe space for you to move through your grief, then reach out to her. And I know it is sincere, having spent, gosh, it feels like I've known you for years, but I've only known you for like a collective 3 hours at this point. And it's just, it radiates through you. Like you want people to feel that. And I think it's no longer about you taking care of other people, but you figuring out and you found a balance in how to hold space for yourself and others. And that's such a healthy and beautiful place to be. And so listeners, if this is something that you're considering, go to her website. It'll be in the show notes. Reach out to her, set up a time to call or to meet her, check out her blog. All of the things that she does are so empowering to help us take ownership of our grief story and our story that integrates and is well beyond our grief as well. As always, we will be back next Sunday with another episode. I invite you to take with you what you can today. Come back to this episode as many times as you need to hear it. And of course, please share this episode with somebody else who might need to feel like they can be held the same way that we were listening to this and talking through this together. We'll see you next Sunday.